Okay, I have to adjust the microphone for my height. Hello, good day, everyone. I am Erica Medina. I used to head a public health research firm back in the Philippines, and we provided evidence to our government that was crucial in shaping policies such as the universal healthcare law, health literacy, and health technology assessment. And now I'm one of the fellows for this inaugural year of our policy fellowship. Like what Josh mentioned, I will be continuing the work that we have already started within biodesign, and I will be establishing a biodesign policy research program across the different fields in medtech, biotech, and digital health. So I'm looking around the room and I'm actually really excited to be here because I finally met the people that we've been working with virtually online in person. And I'm looking forward for more collaborations with all of you for my second year as I'm staying within Stanford. So my project this year focused on biotechnology, specifically in two areas. The first is the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act on the follow-on indications for orphan drugs. And the second, the regulatory pathway for cell and gene therapies. Rare diseases are those that affect fewer than 200,000 people per disease, and currently, only 5% of rare diseases have an FDA-approved therapy or treatment. Policies may have unintended consequences on investments and R&D for treatments that do not exist for many of these conditions or orphan drugs. Similarly, the FDA has spearheaded solutions for efficient approval for cell and gene therapies, therapies that hold great promise for patients with no available treatments before. However, challenges remain for innovators and for investors that support them. Our esteemed panel today will talk about this even more. And to lead this panel, I'd like to introduce Michael Ackermann, who has been a pivotal guide for my project as well. Michael Ackermann is the Director of Biotechnology at Stanford Biodesign, an adjunct professor of bioengineering at Stanford University, as well as the founder and CEO of ArsenalBio. He has co-founded multiple companies, including Tarsus Pharmaceuticals, Oyster Point Pharma, and Oculive. In addition to holding over 70 U.S. patents, he has served in significant roles such as Vice President of Neurostimulation at Allergan, and earned his BE from Vanderbilt University and MS and PhD degrees from Case Western Reserve University. He was also a 2010 to 2011 Innovation Fellow at Stanford Biodesign. Let us all welcome Michael Ackermann.
Well, Erica, thank you so much. I think we've got a really great panel today. We're going to cover two topics. The first is the impact of the IRA, and specifically on rare disease and orphan drugs. And the second is regulation of biologics. But before we do, I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to briefly introduce themselves, and also just a word or two about what you do so they can provide context for the panel. Emil?
Hello, I'm Emil Kakkis. I'm the CEO of Ultragenyx. I've been in the developing rare disease drugs for about 30 years, both earlier at UCLA, then BioMarin, and now at Ultragenyx. And I've been involved in the development approval of 11 rare disease drugs in my career, and currently we have 6 late-stage programs in addition to that in phase 2 or phase 3 right now at Ultragenyx.
Great. Ken?
I'm Ken Drazan. I'm the CEO of ArsenalBio, which is a privately held T-cell therapy company for solid tumors. Prior companies I've helped start are Grail, Verb Surgical, and a variety of others in different parts of the healthcare delivery model.
And I'm Peter Marks, Director of Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA. I'm a hematologist-oncologist by training. Have been in industry and in academics prior to coming to FDA. And our center handles cell gene therapies, vaccines, and blood products.
Hi, my name is Jeff Allen. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called Friends of Cancer Research here in Washington, D.C. Our mission is quite simple. We try and bridge policy solutions with science-based evidence in order to try and accelerate the pace of new medicines for patients.
Hi, I'm Peter Kolchinsky. I'm a scientist by training and an investor. I manage a firm called RA Capital. We've got about 150 people that are really focused on investing in companies that make new medicines, diagnostics, devices, manage about $10, $12 billion depending on the day. And we'll sometimes form companies if we're inspired to do something that's not out there, or we'll invest in existing companies out there. And I also started up a nonprofit called No Patient Left Behind that engages in healthcare reform advocacy in order to deal with the threat of, frankly, flawed policy that might extinguish everything that we're working on.
Well, great. Thank you, guys. And so let's start with our first topic, which is the IRA, and specifically with rare disease. So, Jeff Allen, I'd like to start with you. I'm first going to burden you with the opportunity to just educate and remind the audience what the provision of the IRA is that relates to orphan drugs and price negotiation. And then after that, just as the leader of a patient advocacy organization, help give us the patient perspective and how are the patients that you're representing thinking about this piece of legislation and how it may impact them?
Sure. So I think we've had a tendency perhaps in the last couple of years to refer to all of the IRA as a abbreviation for probably what people want to talk about most, which is the ability for Medicare to negotiate. So I do think it is worth in policy discussions to point out that there are a number of other elements of the IRA that do important things like capping out-of-pocket costs and things that will make a real difference into affordability and access for healthcare. But on the topic at hand around Medicare negotiation, as has been done in the past, I think there attempted to be a recognition that incentives to develop drugs and other therapies to treat rare diseases is a bit skewed when compared to perhaps drugs that are able to be used in a much larger population. And so how do you protect that incentive in order to make sure that that research gets done and hopefully those therapies can be discovered? In the context of the IRA provisions around Medicare negotiation, I think there was a legitimate attempt to try and recognize these differences. And so a couple of provisions that have been debated over the last several months is how to implement an exemption for drugs designed to treat rare diseases. And there's two areas that come into question here frequently. And the first is when, so an exemption is provided for drugs to treat rare disorders, but that exemption is lost when a second orphan drug designation is given. And so that calls into question sort of where the time period is. With that exemption lost, those drugs then become eligible for Medicare negotiation. And then the issue two is when can that negotiation actually begin to occur? Under the current law, it's at the time period starting from that first designation. So it sort of is compressing as opposed for it being designed around the approval of the drug, at which point the drug becomes available and can begin to recoup some of those investments because it's now a marketed therapy. So those don't necessarily align, and I think it's brought into question around whether those incentives to develop therapies for these diseases becomes misaligned and have the incentives been reduced, which would, of course, be a shame if that were the barrier from effective new therapies reaching patients that previously had no other therapies. I think there is a tendency to, oftentimes look at the implementation of these policies and these treatments for the diseases which they're intended to treat. Oftentimes they may be very rare disorders affecting a few patients around the world, but that may just be a starting point, and I think that's a consideration. And it's not just very rare genetic disorders that would be applicable under this time frame. From an oncology perspective, when you look back at the number of different cancer drugs that come to market under an orphan drug designation, over the last 10 years, it's about 75% of the first indications for oncology drugs come to market under an orphan drug designation. And so they would be subject to this differential time frames. And it does call into question how the incentives and the finances and the mathematics will be squared up in order to continue research, again, in oncology, where a number of different drugs that may be discovered to treat one molecular mechanism of one cancer could be quite applicable to other cancers, both big and small in terms of populations and health impact.
So, Emil, you're among the most prolific innovators in orphan drugs, on the planet, I'd say. And so, you're on the front lines here. is it impacting, is it disincentivizing? Is it changing what you're doing? Is it changing your outlook or changing things now?
Well, I think what IRA has introduced is uncertainty too. There's a certain bill in a certain way, but where's it going? What's going to happen afterward? How many more indications? And so the decisions we make in drug development affect 10 to 20 years ahead. And so when people are looking at this and they say, if I had a second indication on my orphan drug, I now open myself up to something changing years from now. Is that a good decision? I think there's been already a few companies that have said they've stopped. And I think that would be a tragedy. I think any bill that stops us from using technology we've already created, we've done all the work, we made a drug, and it could be used successfully in another disease, we shouldn't stop that. That should be important. It should be happen whenever it can happen. And it shouldn't be the basis for how you decide which ones you're going to price regulate. I think this was driven off of certain example cases, which I think often drive legislative thinking, which fail to think about all the other cases. So I think anytime we have a great drug that works, we should be using it for everything. In fact, we worked on at the Every Life Foundation, my foundation, I worked on a bill called the Open Act. And that act was actually intended to take companies with large market drugs and repurpose them to rare diseases. But because there was no financial benefit to doing it, we were trying to give them additional exclusivity as a way to make us get the most out of all these drugs we developed. That was, I think, a very smart bill. So all I would say to you, anything in the IRA that stops you from using drugs to their maximum potential, I think is a mistake.
And maybe Peter Kolchinsky, I'll turn to you. Obviously, you've done a lot of work on this topic, fairly vocal about it. I'll ask you a specific question. I believe this morning you were at an economic conference and talking about communicating the value. Excuse me. Communicating the value of medicines quantitatively, and I'm curious to hear your perspective there. What should lawmakers be thinking about when they're thinking about the value of medicine?
Yeah, so I think that one of the big mistakes that our industry has made is allowing others to practice a form of math that's called cost effectiveness analysis. It's mostly done in other countries, to put out these quantitative assessments of what's a drug worth. And when you look at the motives of those countries, like the UK, their motive is to pay as little as possible. And they're not really at risk that if they pay less, that innovation will stop, because they're a small market and functionally they're free riding. It's kind of like defense spending. Other countries can, invest less in their defense. And at the end of the day, the U.S. Navy is still going to secure the world's oceans. And so they're free riding. But instead of just free riding and enjoying the benefits of America's willingness to incentivize all this innovation, they put out these analyses and they say, well, actually, at that price Americans are paying, that the drug's not worth it, right? And it's starting to impact how Americans think about the drug industry. And even though you have all these insurance plans that are not obligated to pay for a lot of these orphan drugs, they choose to. There's a market, right? And if companies charge way too much, $1 billion per patient, obviously those plans would say no. And if those drugs didn't work at all, even at their current prices, they would say no. There are plenty of commercial duds, and as an investor, I learned from those, right? And so there's this market that assesses what the value of things should be in the U.S., and that market often disagrees with groups like ICER or NICE that have done some computation. A good example is Vertex's drug for cystic fibrosis, Trikafta. It's about $200,000 per patient. And ICER said, well, it's actually $1 million per quality. That's too much. But when you look at that math, which, by the way, almost nobody does. Nobody gets into the math. They just look at the headlines. But it's really important you examine that math. It ignores that drugs go generic. That would be like somebody talking you out of buying a home when you're living in a crappy apartment with rising rent, as I hear is a problem here in Washington, D.C. And they ignore the fact that a mortgage is finite. I mean, that's a terrible financial advisor. But that is the kind of math that's been incubated over there in the UK, because again, it's just a tool to help them justify paying as little as possible. If the US were to adopt such math, thinking that it is the proper measure of the value of medicine and override our market-based mechanism for figuring out what to pay for, I can tell you that we wouldn't invest in anything We actually did a business plan competition. I judged a business plan competition where we told the contestants, don't just give us a pitch for a new technology, set a cap on its price equal to whatever NICE would calculate in the UK. That's your cap. Not a single one of them had a viable plan, right? So it's really important that America be mindful of this kind of math and not adopt these central planning tools, right? And Medicare negotiation has elements built into it. When you look at what it is that CMS is asked to consider, those are the building blocks of what could be very simplified math. Now, it turns out there's better math. You can actually measure the benefits not just of patient, but caregivers. That's called caregiver spillover. You can take into account that a drug will go generic. You build a dynamic model over time. You can take into account the peace of mind we all have knowing a medicine's there, even if we're not using it, like an antibiotic. Nobody really worries about dying from a scratch, even though 100 years ago it could have killed you, right? And that is something we all enjoy. In fact, it's why we buy insurance, purely for the peace of mind. All that is calculable, and real economists know this stuff. The field of health economics did not emerge from real economics. It emerged from public health policy, people who wish to do good, right? And it's a more European discipline. And so they made sure that the math ultimately justified their ends. And their ends was, I just want to, give as much care as possible to as many people, and pharma companies are evil, right? And so the math reflects that. So let's not destroy the vibrant, affordable innovation ecosystem we have. And we do have people that are left behind, but for most Americans it works. Their insurance is good enough and their incomes are high enough to pay their out-of-pocket costs. To help everybody else who is left behind, let's consider the root of affordability. It's out-of-pocket costs. Why is there a copay for chemo? Would anybody go to their doctor and try to fake cancer to score some free chemo if there were a zero copay? No. But we have an unexamined affection for this notion of you got to have skin in the game. And you guys are probably here familiar with Arnold Ventures, right? A lot of Arnold Ventures money, circulating, right? John Arnold, when he was asked on stage, what about out-of-pocket costs? Because he's a big fan of this kind of math, and price controls. And he said, well, look, I had to pay for my own college. I could have partied an extra year at Vanderbilt, but instead I graduated a year early. Can you imagine saying that to a kid with sickle cell anemia? It's like, look, kid, the skin in the game your family has, paying for your medicines, it's good for you. It'll help you graduate from that, right? But that is the ethos he taps into when he funds ICER and funds, a lot of the folks that have been proposing Medicare negotiation, not just at 9 or 13. Their original goal was at launch. The moment, we invest in these drugs, we don't know what Medicare will pay, but they have this very powerful tool to just dictate as a monopsony. They have a monopsony to dictate, here's what we'll pay. And they want to extend it to commercial too. So it's not just going to be for Medicare, it's all drugs. All drugs at launch, you'll be told after the fact what the government thinks you should pay based on a formula. It's kind of Soviet, right? So watch for that and be careful, and don't allow others to tell you how little these drugs are worth. They're actually worth a ton when you do the right math. And I'm trying to encourage the HEOR, Health Economics and Outcomes Research community that's gathered in this conference to showcase these values.
So Ken, it sounds like, please provide your perspective. It sounds like you have a thought.
Just maybe to summarize for Peter's comments, there were some really important bullets there. One is copays don't necessarily align with patients' interests, and that's a funding mechanism that only congressional activities could control. That's not an FDA matter, right? Another one that you pointed out, Peter, so well, is in the area of capturing all the true costs that are allocated towards how medicines benefit patients, and the current system doesn't account for that. Again, not a regulatory issue, one that would be a congressional issue, the way the budget office scored and so forth. Do you want to comment?
Sure.
Yeah, Every Life funded a burden illness study that did the more complete cost of caregiver costs and everything. That's a really important study in capturing what Peter was talking about.
Back to you.
Peter Marks.
I'll just say we don't get into pricing from the FDA. In fact, this came up this morning at the American Society of Gene Cell Therapy meeting. We don't think about the price of a product when we're approving it, and we shouldn't, because it's a very complex calculus. Just as ICER shouldn't think about like what we should do about approvals before we do it. For those of you who haven't seen an article in the JAMA, you'll know what I'm talking about. I don't mind. I can get to bristle here about that a little bit, because they may not know the data. And so there's this concept that I think that actually really, to me, I'm a scientist, and people speaking about scientific things without knowing the data worries me, because that makes me wonder whether it worries me that if they do it here, how often will they do it other places where they're making calculations? Because that's not determining, like drawing the line and then putting points on, that's not science. That's just basically, just getting to the place you want your policy to be.
Agreed. Well, those are the fruit salad analysis. We mix apples and oranges, chop them up, and come up with some numbers that they already predetermined they want to get to. And recently, Steve Uzin talked about some of that stuff, called it drive-by analyses, and called it intellectual malpractice. I kind of tip my hat to Steve Uzin for calling it out, because that's what's going on. That's what the Arnold Foundation is funding, and all the people that write about the academics that pretend to write academic research.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously this was all done in the name of trying to adjust budget impact, right? I mean, so what should we be thinking about? How it's healthcare spending is 20% of GDP. Obviously, some very small fraction of that is pharmaceuticals. But how should we be thinking about that, Peter?
Well, I would love for all Americans to appreciate that the mere 10% of their insurance premiums that they pay every month, directly or through their employer, that goes for branded medicines, is what generates the incentives for all of this amazing innovation in pharmaceuticals. And far smaller fraction that goes for medical devices, a very small fraction for diagnostics. The vast majority of their insurance premiums go to hospitals that would essentially be unchanged, if not for innovation in these other domains. And so it's that small fraction of their premiums, whether it's in taxes, going to Medicare, that is driving all this innovation. If you were to say, I hate pharma, I hate all these companies, let's price control them, you would not lose the things we have. You can't uninvent the medicines we already have. So great, you would immediately save some money. That 10%, if you genericize all those drugs, you'd maybe reduce health insurance premiums by 8% instantly. And then within 5 years, your health insurance premiums would be even higher. And all those hospitalizations, all those nursing homes that we could have kept people out of, right? We would now be spending even more on that. Remember, this isn't a choice between buying a house, paying that mortgage, and not. You're living in a crappy apartment with rising rent. Hospital costs are rising. Alzheimer's is gonna make us pay more. And so if we want to get to better health, if we ever want to aspire to a perfect 100 years for the average baby born, right? Then ultimately medicines that are only temporarily expensive and then go generic are a way better way of getting there than by, building more hospitals and nursing homes. So we got to give America that bigger picture view of what its budget is doing. Some of it is rent expense, but a tiny bit of it is actually investment in a better future. You got to separate investment from expense.
So this is great. I feel like we could probably talk about this for at least the entire panel. I do want to transition us to the second topic and hopefully give ourselves an opportunity for a couple of audience questions as well. So regulation of cell and gene therapies at CBER. Peter Marks, I'd like to start with you. First of all, congratulations on the approval of Casgevy. Shameless plug, has some Stanford connections. But really a landmark approval for all of human health, really. So sincere congratulations there. You have talked publicly about some of the challenges, at CBER and with regulation of cell and gene therapies, specifically challenges getting first-in-human studies open, preclinical burdens, and the like. And you've also been making change And so would you like to share with us some of the initiatives that you've
Yeah, so no, first of all, thanks so much. And I think the truth is that innovators, first generation of any product, what we're dealing with now in gene therapy are very expensive products that are transformative, potentially, and the next generations of them will be even more transformative. But if we don't take the steps now, we're never going to get there. Additionally, until we have, I think, a critical mass of these products, the costs of making them are not going to come down significantly. So there's the issue of manufacturing advances, which is something I think we have to work on. But I think that will come as there are more products out there. But then there are the issues of, are there things that we can do from a regulatory perspective that can help the ecosystem right now? And there are, because there are several things that we have not leveraged to the fullest extent, particularly in this area of gene therapy, where this is a very different. Having worked in industry on small molecules, where we did drug screens to try to find something that hit a target to make a disease X better. Those are very high-risk endeavors that any given molecule has a hair's fraction of actually making it all the way. On the other hand, these genetic medicines, they have a very, if they're done right, there's a really nice probability of success from the outset. And we need to start treating them a little bit more that way. One of the ways we can help things along here is by maximally using our accelerated approval provisions, where here we don't require a clinical endpoint like how someone feels, functions, or survives to give an initial approval. We rely on a biomarker, which could even be the product of the gene therapy or something in the pathway, to give an initial approval, and then we can take our time and get the clinical evidence that we need. For some of the rare diseases that we're dealing with, that is a huge relief, because it's very hard to get the data, the natural history data, or even the run-in data over the course of a year or two to be able to do a clinical trial otherwise to ultimately bring benefits. So we're trying to leverage accelerated approval. Two other things that we think we can have as levers are, first of all, there are different regulators across the globe have different regulatory barriers to get into those locations. Sometimes they require slightly different studies. Sometimes it's just a lot of paperwork. And one of the goals we are having is to try to bring some degree of regulatory convergence so that it becomes easier when somebody develops a product in the United States, they can actually get it into other markets more readily, so that something that's not really commercially viable for a profit here in the United States becomes profitable because it's got a larger market. Now, you have to deal with some of the other, the NICE and others in other places, but still, the broader market should help, because there are higher income countries in Europe and in Asia that will help there. And then the other piece of this is that, the development time can be years, and a lot of that time is for small companies is white noise while they're waiting to hear back from FDA in order to solve problems. Issues come up. We have meetings. Our meeting timeline currently is between 30 and 75 days, depending on the type of issue. During the pandemic, we learned what can happen when you get rid of the 30 to 75 day waiting period, because with the vaccine manufacturers, we had constant communication because we had to do it fast. That was the principle of Operation Warp Speed. I can vouch for it. And we had ongoing dialogue so that when an issue came up, we resolved it quickly. And we probably reduced the time to the development of those vaccines by at least 25% from time from first cloning of the sequence to when we had an emergency use authorization approved, because of this constant communication. And so we think by doing all of these things, maybe each one won't be perfect, but we can try to help reduce the time to development, which then reduces cost. Additionally, regulatory certainty increases investment. I'm not an MBA, but it is a principle that I do think works. So to the extent that we can develop pathways that people can follow to get products faster to patients in medical need, I think we can potentially make a big difference in people's lives. The companies can make the profits that they need to be able to continue developing them, and the science can actually progress so that we get ever better products coming along, because despite the fact that the first generation CRISPR, Casgevy it's remarkable. I mean, the first description of CRISPR-Cas9 in the literature was around 2012. It was discovered a little before that, but to have a product approved that was made with it is remarkable. Now, it's a cell-based product. The next generation of these products are going to be probably CRISPR constructs that will be directly administered, and that's going to, I think, be incredibly revolutionary, because it turns out that the manufacturing process for those constructs will be probably an order of magnitude less expensive than our current. But if we won't get there unless we do the innovation here and go through these generations. So I think this is part of the innovator's dilemma. You're going to have $4,000 computers before you have $300 computers.
Can I give a plug to Peter? Like 4 months faster vaccines. I don't think a lot of people understand what that's worth. Like, we lost $15 trillion of global economic activity during the pandemic because everybody was nervous. They did not have peace of mind. They were anxious. They retreated from the economy. And so that 4 months, that sounds like it's worth like $4 trillion. So whatever it is it would cost us out of our budget to give the FDA the bandwidth to be that interactive on many other programs, the actual societal value of that saved time is tremendous. Yeah. So as policymakers think about that and how to fund the FDA, consider the bigger impact. You got to ask the CBO to actually model that, or they'll tell you, oh no, that's just going to be a budgetary hit. It's terrible.
Yeah, we're actually doing a pilot now with that we're going to shortly to be announced. This 3 companies that were selected by our center and 3 by the Center for Drugs, where we're doing the same Operation Warp Speed interaction, where we're measuring milestones, because we realize that as we go into our next user fee negotiation, someone's going to want data, because I think once we have some data, you'll be able to do kind of like it's the analogy of a net present value calculation of the worth of okay, if we spent $10 million more, had 30 or 40 more reviewers to do this, what would you get out? And I think that it's going to be like one of these overwhelming no-brainers, but we'll get the data.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. Clear as. Sounds like great ROI to me. And so I'm going to get everyone's perspective here. I want to sort of turn to our innovators next. And are you feeling these changes at the agency? 1 and 2, have they gone far enough? What else is still causing problems for you?
Sure. And if the audience can't tell the urgency that Dr. Marks brings to the opportunity here, your eyes must be closed and your ears must be muffled. So thank you for communicating your sense of urgency and what you're delivering for all of us. I would also just applaud, because I hadn't heard about the quote pseudo Operation Warp Speed that you're bringing together for these opportunities. And if it is such, I'm sure almost a marketplace strategy, if such a thing could be brought to it, would find a lot of active participants in it. It doesn't have to be in the traditional way to fund. So if there was some economic innovation alongside it, it might even herald it faster and increase the talent pool that you're chasing after. As it relates to one specific area that I'm focused on, which is using cell therapy for solid tumor treatments, you brought up the opportunity of how biomarkers can be introduced for the treatment of rare diseases and how that would be an accelerant. Do you see that as an opportunity also in further evolution in solid tumor treatment? And another sort of follow-on question is, in cell therapy, there is this upfront challenge for innovators in early development, where one has to have a sort of stage delay in enrolling patients, which ultimately is very similar to the orphan challenge, because it's a very high cost delay.
Yeah. So I think for solid tumors, I think there is a way to accelerate things here, and I think oncology, we're very lucky because we can build off of what's been done
Yes.
in other areas. So I think more to come, and I think we'll look forward to a discussion on this because as a hematologist oncologist by training, this would be really, to me, it's amazing what, as a leukemia doctor, not a solid tumor doctor, it's amazing what the chimeric antigen receptor T cells have done. I mean, it almost makes me cry every time I see, Emily Whitehead and her father. They have a foundation. I'm not violating HIPAA. This girl should be dead. She should absolutely be dead. And you have a therapy that has saved her, and about 50% of the kids like her. It's not perfect, but and I think to have something that, even if it's not perfect for solid tumors. But to have this could be transformational again, either for advanced cancers, but also for the 50% of not so advanced lung cancers that relapse if you had an immunotherapy that can clean up the residual disease. So I think we're very open to applying that. And then, I think this is something that it's cell therapies are probably one of the hardest nuts to crack because of the various challenges in the fact that cells that aren't programmed tend to do what they want to do. Mm-hmm. But I do think our folks are getting a better sense of comfort, and I think part of that gets to something that you were alluding to, being able to attract the best talent, because the more talented people we can attract to FDA, the more innovative they are about being willing to, instead of taking that month between, figuring out ways to use Bayesian designs or other ways to shorten that. But I'll be the first to acknowledge we need to do better. We need to find better ways in the cell therapy space because we do lag there in comparison.
Yeah, and Jeff, actually, I'd love to get the voice of the patient here. I mean, this is a perfect example. You're leading a prominent cancer patient advocacy group, right? And some of these things that Ken is talking about here are sort of in the name of safety and conservatism for the very patients that you represent. Help us understand the mindset of the patients. I mean, their speed to gap between one patient, wait times to the next, et cetera. I mean, where is the mindset of the patient here?
Yeah, there's certainly a balance. There's always going to be a balance, and it may be very individualized in terms of balancing the potential benefit with the known or unknown risks. But I think what's sort of been described here is there is an unmet medical need, a lot of them. And, I know you didn't mean to leave this out of your calculation around the time that was saved through expediting vaccine development, but, it also included thousands of people's lives that, had access to these products all the faster due to the innovation, the willingness and the hard work of Peter and his colleagues at FDA. These are many of them are highly trained medical professionals who, keep the people who need these drugs at the forefront of their actions. And so hopefully technology is allowing for some of these expedited types of approaches to be applied, because there are new technologies. Hopefully the magnitude of effect is higher, and that sort of can offset the risk and the benefit. I think we oftentimes, as a health kind of environment, tend to focus on each of the new drugs that are approved and why and the benefits that they're coming. But I think it's also worthwhile to think about some of the the sources of evidence that can help inform that. And I think this is true maybe in the cell and gene therapy space, certainly in the immunology space more generally, where there are emerging endpoints that are able to detect whether these drugs are working earlier than perhaps conventional approaches like imaging. Molecular-based response has been something that I think will become an important part of oncology. We've seen it on the drug side in the hematology space recently, where FDA gave a favorable nod toward the utilization of minimal residual disease as an example of a measure to earlier determine whether in multiple myeloma, whether these therapies were effective. And I think the same will likely be true, hopefully, in the solid tumor space, looking at things like circulating tumor DNA, which may have a similar MRD type of approach in earlier disease settings. There isn't necessarily always a process to go through to sort of validate these endpoints the same way there is a process to go through approving a drug. So I think it's really contingent on the collaboration of the community to generate the evidence to support whether these endpoints are useful or not. And it's not just in terms, back to your original question, it's not just in terms of expediting the approval of a drug. Yes, that's a component of it, but with some of these intermediate measures of molecular response, and they may even indicate which patients don't need to be treated or subjected to potentially toxic treatment. So yes, they have a role in drug development, but they also could play a role in effective clinical decision making and help patients determine the best course of treatment for themselves.
I have one thought on that. I think what you're talking about is getting close to the source and measuring source of disease, right? Which is what accelerated approval is intended to do. Look, the biomarker minimal risk of disease or other earlier stage, we should be designing drugs to focus on that. And when we talk about biomarker approvals for inborn errors, we're talking about disease. The biomarker is the disease cause. It's the source of disease. The best way to prove that drug is based on that, not on a clinical outcome, which is very noisy and way downstream. And the analogy I give is like trying to decide if your car brakes are broken and trying to measure how well your brakes are working by looking at car crashes. But you can measure the brakes way easier, very precisely and up front. You know if you have bad brakes, you're going to crash. But how you crash depends on a lot of other factors. Less like clinical outcomes. A lot of other factors affect the crash. The truth is, the next generation of treatment should be focused on source of disease, just like it did for HIV. In HIV, going to viral load is the only way we got there. If you try to do clinical outcomes, you never get the drugs. We've never finished. The biomarkers are not a compromise. They're superior in many cases. And what's more important is the mood now about not paying for things to their accelerated approval is completely wrong-headed. And I asked a payer who was making this point, I said, so you would have let all the HIV patients die because you wouldn't have paid for any of the HIV drugs. And the first step wouldn't have happened, Peter, nor the second, nor the third, or the fourth. We never got there. He tried to avoid the answer, but that was the truth. The truth is, accelerated approval is the next way of how we approach things. By looking at source of disease, and we design drugs with source of disease, we'll actually get to closer to curing disease instead of making better bumpers or seatbelts, which is what happens when you focus on clinical outcomes and make Alzheimer's disease that stimulate your brain a little but are not going to fix the problem. So the truth is you actually orient your drugs in the right way of getting to the source. So I want to be clear that I think, and I want to applaud Peter for being a champion and moving this direction. It's really the way medicine has to go. And we're going to do so much better things by picking source of disease and measuring the beginning and designing drugs to fix and cure disease.
Can I annotate what Emil just said with a little economics? So indeed, we've got over 1 million people that are HIV positive and alive, living healthy lives today, right? Not in the hospitals. Like there was a time that MD Anderson thought that it was going to be an HIV hospital. And then the drugs basically said, no, we don't need you for that. So they're like, okay, we'll tackle oncology. It was such an amazing transformation. And I think average American income is about $70,000. That's a little higher than GDP per capita, but and that's like $70 billion of wages. Again, on top of the lives saved and all the joy, and life that is created. That's $70 billion. Those drugs don't cost anything near that, even at American prices, and that's even before they've gone generic. So now imagine for the rest of all time, all that productivity unlocked. And yet, Arnold Ventures funds somebody that will do some other math to talk you into believing that they're overpriced and in need of price controls. Well, imagine if you had been successful back in the 80s. We wouldn't have had these HIV drugs. And would we be better off? Would we be saving money? Or would we have two MD Andersons, one working on oncology, an entire other building staffed with tons of people just trying to deal with HIV, with whatever a hospital can do, right? So let the market, let all of this competition that you heard about, let it work out like solutions to all these problems, and just focus on, what Milton Friedman would have told you to focus on. Make sure that there are no natural monopolies. Like that's bad for capitalism. So if you see drugs that aren't going generic by any mechanism and they're just stuck, they're expensive forever, that's not the intent of the patent system. When I'm here in like year -10 of a drug's launch, I don't care about some revenues 20, 30 years down the line. I care about that initial patent period, what Hatch-Waxman gave us. So focus on those and don't listen to the people that would have you believe that this whole system's broken and we've got to come in with a central planning tool to like let Medicare just set prices. Really dangerous kind of thinking.
So I want to take time for one or two audience questions. Do we have anything? Please. Just speak up if you like, yeah.
So I want to view Dr. Marks and perhaps anybody else on the panel. Where do we need to go with
It's on.
where do we need to go with evidence generation? I mean, years ago, Tom Frieden wrote a piece in the New England Journal about, when he was head of CDC saying the RCT is dead. Long live the RCT. I know that the agency has become much more receptive to real-world evidence. And we know that real-world evidence uncovers things that we would never know. Look at immunotherapy drugs and all the things we learned after they launched. We would have never known that. So where should we be heading in terms of evidence generation?
Yeah. So we should be heading in the direction of real-world evidence. We should be heading in actually probably spending more time improving what we can gain from real-world evidence. But that actually requires a grassroots effort outside of FDA, which is the current medical record is it may be fit for purpose for billing, but it's not fit for purpose for actually extracting good information that could lead to real-world evidence trials. So once we get there, hopefully we're going to see that improve. AI maybe will be the, going back to the last panel, AI may be a savior here if it ultimately does the right thing with clinical encounters and you actually get information into the medical record that's not just copy-pasted so that we have a lot of normal female genitalia in males, with copy paste. So I couldn't agree with you more and that would actually be a wonderful thing because if we had that kind of evidence generation, we could do more accelerated approvals because you on the back end could much more easily capture the clinical endpoints that you need to confirm things out without expensive trials.
Well, I think that is perfectly timed. I think we're literally exactly at time. So if you can please help me thank our panelists.
Thank you very much. Great job, panel. Thank you, Michael. So I'm just going to wrap this up and thank you all for attending today, whether you're here in person or online. A special thank you to all our panelists today. All our moderators, our keynote speaker, fantastic content today. And I just want to say, the purpose of this is to bring us together to begin these conversations and also to work together in the future. So I hope that you'll think of us, reach out. We could always use collaborators and those interested in further research on these topics. We'd love to work with you. Also want to thank our amazing team that actually put this together. Deja Hill, Owl Otto, Debbie Boyland, and Susie Spielman. Thank you so much. An amazing job. Owl, thank you. Nice job. And a special thanks to our amazing fellows, Liana, Rebecca, Rory, and Erica. Thanks for kicking off the sessions. Nice job. Okay. So the last note is just please try to take that survey, that little those little cards that you're going to get right now. If you could take just a few minutes, we'd love your feedback and ideas. This is the first one ever, so I'm sure there's opportunities for us to improve. And as you can see, I'll just leave on the most important note. There's so much that needs to be done to advance patient care. So many things that we can do to have policies that really enhance and protect our ecosystem, this fragile innovation ecosystem that supports patients and the advancement of medicine. So I hope you'll all join us in that pursuit. And thank you and have a good afternoon and evening. Thank you.